Heading south of the Mason-Dixon, this is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 286, covering the week of November 1st through November 5th, 2021. Glad to have you back on the program. Very glad to be here. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter, like our Gab page, and subscribe to our YouTube page. Our YouTube page is invaluable. It's great stuff, right? We've got so much good material up there. Lectures, podcasts, our short little Abbeville U videos. It's just tremendous stuff. So head on over to YouTube, subscribe to that. Also, we do exist on your generous contributions alone. So if you like this podcast, you like our website, you like our conferences, all of that stuff, consider a tax-deductible donation to the full extent of the law. It is the end of the year if you are trying to make your tax preparations, and you are going to get some emails about this if you're on an email list. So I'll talk about that in a minute. But if you are making your tax preparations, this is when we do start saying, can you help us out? We did a lot this year. We have completed a lot of projects this year. And if you're on the email list, you're going to get a list of all that stuff. So head on over to abbevilleinstitute.org, Abbeville, institute.org. Give us that email address, get that free ebook, Exploring the Southern Tradition. And, of course, you get our daily dose of Dixie Monday through Friday. You also get correspondence from us, and we are going to be asking for some money. Right? I mean, we are a 501c3 organization. We do exist based on what you're willing to give us. It's the only way we can continue to do all this stuff. And we've had a good year at the Institute. We've had some ups and downs in terms of things going on in the South. A couple of encouraging things coming out of the election this week on November 2nd in Virginia. And this is something that people pointed out several times. Well, there were 3 counties in Virginia that had ballot initiatives. Do we take down these Confederate monuments? And almost 2/3 of the people said, no, leave them up. That's amazing. That's actually encouraging. And I think one thing we have to do, and we have to be mindful of this, both at the Institute and everywhere else. We have to be positive. The Southern tradition has so much to offer people that's positive. So many things about it that are positive. I know when you read people talk about conservatism or traditionalism, it's necessarily pessimistic, or it's entrenched, it's rigid, it's reactionary, it's all these things. And certainly it can be that. But the tradition of the South, and by default Western civilization, I mean, it offers such beautiful things for people. It doesn't matter where you're from or who you are. I mean, that's the thing about the Southern tradition that's so great. It offers something for just about anybody. I mean, who can't go through, even if you're not from the South, or I don't care what race you are or what your religious background is, who cannot read William Faulkner and think this is great, or go back and read some of the poetry that the South produced, particularly people like Tim Rod and others, or read Edgar Allan Poe, which we had a great piece by Casey Chalk last week on Edgar Allan Poe. Who can't go read those things and say, wow, this is really good. Eudora Welty? You're going to read it and you're going to love it. And it could only be produced by particular people in a particular place in a particular time. Who isn't enamored with Southern music, which, as the Allman Brothers pointed out, is American music? Who doesn't have those feelings? This is the important part about the South. Southern cooking's great, right? I mean, it's the best stuff America's produced in terms of America, not coming from somewhere else, but American food. Southern food is the best food ever produced. And of course, it's all the interactions and all the things going on in the South that make all that possible. It's all the flavors of the South that make that possible. You know, you could say, and Republicans did say it. This is something that people forget about the 1850s and the 1860s. Republicans said it over and over again. The reason they didn't like the South, it was too diverse. It's too much influence of other things going on there. You had too much of outside influence. It wasn't, purely Anglo-Saxon enough, or white enough is what they would say, but they use those terms. It wasn't that. It had too much influence from other things. Those influences is what made the South very interesting. And of course, You start with the Albion seed. You start with the Cavalier culture and the Celtic culture, the backcountry, the borderlands culture. Celtic might be too broad, but borderlands regions of the British Isles. You start with that, and then you throw in some of the Dutch and the French influence, Spanish influence, of course, also African influence, and all of that. It creates this very interesting culture. It's beautiful. It has its love of neoclassicism, its love of republicanism, its love of the land, its religious elements. It's all these things that make the South such a beautiful place. And the most interesting part of America. It's not to say there's not cultures in other places, in other parts of America, even going back to the 17th century. We know that the Puritans and Quakers had their own distinctive English folkways. We know it. The Puritans certainly did, but their culture was nowhere near as interesting as Southern culture. Now, it should be. I mean, we should talk about the Deep North. We should study the Deep North, and we do that quite a bit, but at the Abbeville Institute. But the fact is, when we look at these things, we have to consider there's a reason why the South is so studied. And for some on the left, it's because they want to find all the evil people they can out there. They want to study Calhoun to see the root of all American evil. It's so silly. But it is, of course, what they want to do. This is why we have Southern studies, because the South is supposedly the oddball. But even anybody that knows anything points out it wasn't really the oddball in the 18th century or the 19th century. It was the North that was the odd section, not the South. The North was the odd place. The South was simply holding on to American traditions and, by default, the traditions of Western civilization. So we had a bunch of great stuff this week. We had a really good... I want to start with the Friday piece. I want to start with that by Boyd Cathy. And I want to start with it because he actually links back to an article that Paul Gottfried wrote and we published in 2014 entitled Why Do They Hate the South and Its Symbols? And it's a really good piece. But Boyd adds something to it here. And we link to that article, of course, and we have something else we're going to run by Dr. Cathy next week. But I want to read this particular part, this piece, because I think that, again, you're seeing some things in America. You're seeing some things develop, and the root of every evil in America has to be the South. If it's not, and I mentioned this in my own podcast, if you don't get the Brian McClanahan show, you should. What happened on Tuesday in Virginia of November 2nd, and of course I'll talk about it next week on the Brian McClanahan show, I should say. What happened on Tuesday in Virginia was simply the outgrowth of people not being wanting to call name. I mean, they don't want to be called a name by somebody else, right? So you had people that would have voted for Biden, but they were called names now by the left, so they're going to vote against the people that call them names. They're going to get rid of them. They don't necessarily disagree with the positions, but they don't want to be called the names. Because they would all agree fundamentally, I think, that Robert E. Lee was bad, that John C. Calhoun is bad. They don't know anything. So Cathy says, much history has passed since then, since Paul Gottfried gave this speech in 2007. Much of it very damaging and destructive of those Southern and Confederate traditions and inheritance we once cherished and considered normative and part of our Southern lives as folk. We have witnessed in recent years the virtual stripping away of our heritage handed down to us faithfully by our fathers and their fathers, the banning of our revered flags and symbols, the vicious destruction of our monuments, the expulsion of our literature and the rewriting of our history, and the attempt to extinguish our very memory, both publicly and privately in our schools and the environment in which we live. It is no exaggeration to say that these efforts by crazed fanatics, enabled and often supported by weak-willed and even more weak-minded conservatives and many Republicans, is a form of cultural genocide. No, not in the literal sense where physical violence is used, although increasingly violence unrestrained and mostly unpunished by the authorities is employed, but in a progressive sense, using largely our educational system, our schools and colleges, our entertainment industry, and the media. Mostly have sat by while this has happened, this gradual infection with a fatal venom which will, if not thwarted, finally destroy its intended target. How many of us have children or grandchildren? How many of us know friends with children or grandchildren? Well, those offspring, our progeny, thanks to the imposed environment around us, have no true knowledge of their heritage or consider it racist and bigoted. Now, let me stop there for something, say something about this. This is not new. I wrote a piece years ago for the Institute, and it's actually in my book, Southern Scribblings, where there's a man named Cousins. And he talks about how his granddaughter was sat in his lap. He fought for the Confederacy. His granddaughter sat in his lap and said, "It's okay if you are wrong. I still love you anyways." This is a man, a veteran, fought in the war. And his grandchildren had already been taught that he was wrong. And his point was, we need to correct this. And this is what many Southerners were saying at the turn of the 20th century. They were already being inundated with it then. But they tried to correct it. They put out their side of the story. This is the monumental study of the South and the Building of the Nation series. It's great. And of course, people, oh, it's racist. Well, I mean, these were racist people, so they're going to write racist things, all right? So, I mean, okay, so there's lots of things that have been, are we going to say this about everything? But they said, I mean, there's a lot of good work in that particular set of volumes. Or the South, the literature of the South, which is another great collection of stuff. I mean, Southerners consciously tried to understand, okay, we're being told, or the American public at large is being told, that we're traitors, we're bad, we're awful people, and we're going to fight back by publishing stuff and doing things and showing that we're as much part of America, the South, and the building of the nation. That the South was integral to the success of the United States as anything else, and that Confederate heroes are American heroes. That is what's under attack now. That is what's going on. What we need is a revitalization of this point of, hey, look, the South produced a lot of great stuff. The South was integral in all these things. And most Americans, normal Americans, not those on the left, not those that are woke, not those that have gone so far, they're lunatics, most Americans see that and think, oh yeah, there's something about that. I like the South. You know, this is the talk I gave at the summer school several years ago on Southern music, where you had all these songs written in the early 20th century. You know, that's what I like about the South. Everything's good if it comes from Dixieland. I mean, these kind of things that were certainly part of the lexicon of Americans. And they just recognized, yeah, the South is great. It's warm. You got nice people down there, good food. Great place to be. Wonderful place to be. Now you've got people that move to Richmond. It's dark and terrible. We've got to change it all. Or they're going to go to Charleston, and they want to change everything about Charleston that makes it Charleston to make it more like New York or Boston. So eventually it's just going to be awful. You see, they're trying to get away from these things, so they come to the South and they try to make it just like where they're from. It's awful. It's psychotic. Their monuments come down in many cases in the most ignominious manner. Then Congress, the so-called conservative political party, the GOP, joins with the rabidly radical Democrats to vote overwhelmingly to rename all U.S. military forts named for Confederate generals. The memory of those once highly respected and honorable soldiers is now consigned to the dustbin of history. I mean, this is true. Republicans did this. Republicans voted to change these names. Their names are on the list of the roll call of the votes. Republicans did it. Not every Republican in every southern state. Republicans did it, though. Across the South, prominent Republicans, think here, for example, of South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley and Senator Lindsey Graham, call and get the takedown of Confederate symbols. These are our defenders? Give me a break. They are rather cowardly enablers. This rot, this fatal infection, did not happen all at once. No, it was not just Dylan Roof's senseless and criminal act back in 2015. It was not the mass media effort to turn the Charlottesville incident into racist violence, nor was it the media-driven attempt to convert the death of convicted felon and drug abuser George Floyd into some sort of modern saint. Of course, they served as opportunities for the lunatic post-Marxists to tighten the screws and control and the control they have over our society. But the contagion must be traced back to our own ignorance and our own incapacity or unwillingness to see and understand what was happening more than 50 years ago. And again, I would say this was happening right after the war. This was happening in the 1850s. This was happening at any time. You had this Yankee push. I mean, I remember when I was graduating, getting my PhD, Clyde Wilson and I were in the line, the procession line, getting ready to walk on stage. And one of the other professors started saying something about Emerson. And Clyde never missed an opportunity to jab at one of his foolish colleagues, said, well, something along the lines, Emerson is one of the most overrated people in American history. And of course, she didn't like that a whole lot. And then he started saying, yeah, I mean, every 50 years or so, Yankees go crazy. They go nuts, and they start doing things. This is true. I mean, they do. They go nuts about every 50 years, and we're seeing it, right? We're seeing it. About every 50 years or so, they go nuts. Now, we're in a continued phase. So you look at 2015. Well, what was 50 years before that? Well, 1965, right? So we're in that period of time where they're going nuts right now, and we're seeing the result of it. Now, Boyd's going to go back to the 70s, but you could go back to the 1960s. You go back to the 19-teens. You go back to the 1860s. You go back to before that. About every 50 years, they go nuts. So Boyd says, when I was in graduate school at the University of Virginia in the early 1970s, I met and knew other grad students there who carried with them the kernel of revolution and anti-Southern hatred. At first, it seemed just an academic affair we would debate in some of our graduate courses. Indeed, their views would be considered fairly conservative today. But many of my former classmates became professors and teachers, some at prestigious universities. And they carried with them that cancer which continues to metastasize and expand its tentacles. And now their students also teach a new generation, a generation almost completely unhinged and woke, of deranged post-Marxists whose fanaticism knows no limits, whose hatred knows no boundaries. Not to mention Hollywood and the anti-Confederate control of the conservative movement, as exemplified by the staunch anti-Confederate animus consistently displayed at Fox News. Was anyone able to watch Brett Baer's recent puff piece on President Ulysses Grant? He was, according to Bauer, our nation's greatest civil rights president who stared down those evil Southern racists and, of course, Republican whom we should all admire. Noted author Dr. Anthony Esselin, in a feature article in the November issue of Chronicles magazine, distinguishes between hope and optimism, and rightly writes that he is not optimistic for the future of the country, but he continues to have the God-given virtue of hope, and that in the end will trump all else. Likewise, we view our situation and the circumstances in the historic South, it is very difficult to be optimistic. Yet hope is something else, something vouchified to us by our Creator, something that no one can take from us. Only we can despoil or renounce it. And I think that's important. I mean, Robert E. Lee said, it's history that teaches us to hope. History that teaches us to hope. And I think that hope and optimism, we have that. We have that dichotomy, and I think that's important to note, and that people conservatives can generally be pessimistic. But when you look at what's happening, and you look at all the things going on today, and you look at where we are as the Institute, right? We're positioned in a unique area. We have a little niche. This is why we ask for your support and all that. We have a niche here. We have the ability to try to keep that Southern tradition alive. And of course, every now and then we look at the people like Dr. Cathy, he's aging, Clyde Wilson aging, Don Livingston aging. We just had a piece, Tom Moore, who wrote a lot of fun little books, novels on the South, and he died in August, and I wasn't aware of that. And of course, it's important to note that we have an aging group of people who are doing really good things, or have done really good things for years, and in their 80s. We need younger people, to come on board and do these things. And how do we reach young people? I mean, that's a real question. How do you do it? young conservatives are being taught at Fox News that Ulysses Grant was great. Ulysses Grant was great. And that's a problem. That's a problem. Ulysses Grant, as we showed in a piece by Thomas Byard last week, we had a speech that he gave in 1875. I think I said in the podcast 1879. I don't know what I was thinking. 1875, 60 years after the Battle of New Orleans. But he points to the corruption of the Grant administration, the corruption of the Republicans in Louisiana. And yet we're told that was all okay. That was all fine. It's all good. All fine. But this is why I really like Boyd's piece, because we have a big uphill battle. And a couple other pieces this week. We have The Southern Heritage and New Right Populism by Jim Peterson. And what I think is interesting about this, and he points out some things that are essential, we don't have very many friends. And I was segueing into that with the discussion of Fox News. We don't have many friends on the right. I mean, we don't. Southern conservatives don't. Southerners in general don't. They are the easy prey, the easy target for everything that's wrong in America. The easy target. They are the ones that when anything goes bad, it's the South. South is bad. The South did all these bad things. It's John C. Calhoun is bad. It's Robert E. Lee is bad. It's Jefferson Davis is bad. All these people are bad. George Washington's bad. Thomas Jefferson's bad. James Madison's bad. All bad. They're just, everything bad goes right back to the South. And it ignores the deep North, of course, because we don't have Northern studies programs. That's what should have happened in the 20th century. They should have had all these Southern institutions, should have set up Northern studies programs to be funny. They should have done it. We're going to study the North because they're the odd people. We're going to study the odd people. We don't need reflection on ourselves because we've got so many Northerners coming in and trying to tell us. All these Southern studies programs hired Northerners. You look at who's in these Southern studies programs. They're all carpetbaggers. They're all people that, I'm going to study the South, Southern history, and they're not from the South. So their whole point is to try to figure out what's wrong with it. That's the whole thing. The Southern studies programs, I mean, what do you need that for? Study the North and then put Southerners in charge of those things. So, I mean, we should do this. Of course, we don't control any institutions. But if we could control some institutions, we should hire a deep North studies program and hire all Southerners to do it and just write vitriolic papers about the North and how backwards all these Yankees are and the Puritans and everything else. Just all this stuff. Just go out there and produce all these things. It would be absolutely hilarious. And put them in academic, create our own academic journal. We, of course, don't have the resources at the Institute to do this, but if you had a university backing to do it, it would be absolutely hilarious. And just watch the leftists squirm because they won't know how to react to that. Now, in some cases, when you look at in some cases they are looking at themselves, reflecting on their own complicity in things. You have that book, that Pharaoh book, Complicity, which is about Northern involvement in American slavery. They're starting to do that, and in some cases, you have some discussion on some of these Ivy League campuses about their checkered past on some things. And they're starting to put up markers. Of course, they're not taking anything, not changing the name of Brown University, for example. They won't do that. Not at all. And they won't take down Timothy Dwight's name from anywhere, Yale. They won't do that. They'll take down Calhoun, but they won't take down Dwight, who was, wrote some pretty pro-slavery stuff at times. But regardless, it's important to note that the North has always been the odd section, and that Northern view of history is the real problem in America. So we had this piece by Jim Peterson on Southern populism, and getting into the fact that whoever appoints themselves the designated leaders of American populism today, they don't understand the South. I mean, even Tucker Carlson, who is this guy that people go ballistic. I mean, oh yeah, Tucker Carlson's great. Tucker Carlson just devours this anti-Southern bias. Now some of this, okay, I have to let people in on some things. Some of this is because of corporatism. They have to do it. You got Fox News putting out a book by one of their own. And what they're going to do to sell books is tell all of these talking heads, you got to bring them on your program and you got to talk about it. And you can't really say anything negative about it. And, I know this when you have quote unquote conservative books. I mean, this is what happens. You get on some radio, you get on some television. Nobody even reads the stuff. I mean, I'll never forget an interview I did when I wrote 9 Presidents Who Screwed Up America. And it was a pretty prominent program out in California. And it was late at night. I had to stay. I mean, it was 11 o'clock at night. I had to go on this guy's show. And I don't usually stay up that late, 11 o'clock at night. So I said, okay, I'll do it. Guy's got a lot of listeners. Big voice. I'm not going to say who it was. Big voice out in California. So he gets me on there, and I'm scheduled for an hour. He hasn't even looked at the book. So what he does is he looks at the cover, and he says, all right, well, let's talk about who's on the cover. George Washington? George Washington's on your cover? How can you put George Washington as a president who screwed up? I mean, he just started going off on me. He had never even, but see, he was given, I was going to be the guest, they booked me, and he didn't like anything I had to say. And then there was a discussion with another prominent conservative at one point. I think this was for how Alexander Hamilton screwed up America. And again, hadn't read it, but I talked about, didn't like the fact that I was bashing Hamilton. How, Lord forbid, somebody, conservative, bash Hamilton. And his point was the British have no constitution. They don't have a constitution. I said, well, that would be news to the founding generation who talked about their constitution. Oh, it's unwritten. Well, it's still a constitution, isn't it? But his point was to argue with me. You see, so sometimes if it's so outlandish in their mind, they'll attack. But most of the time you go on these things and it's there just to promote the book, and they ask you some pretty softball questions, vanilla stuff. And this is why, Bret Baier is going to get his book out there. And of course, Fox News is promoting all this because it's the Jaffa position of we've got to have conservatives, equality as conservative, because that's the only way we're going to win elections. We can't be called these bad names. They don't get it, right? So we have no champions, and I think Jim Peterson is pointing that we have no allies in American conservatism. American populism, what is that? It's lost all its southern roots. And when you look at the piece on Wednesday by Rado Barr, when he talks about, you want to know what the founding was about, ask a Canadian. It's interesting you bring up MacDonald, who was MacDonald's being canceled in Canada. I've gotten some people that listen to my show sending me stuff on that. John MacDonald, who was the founder of Canada, essentially, is being canceled because he said some things that are considered today to be racially insensitive. And but this is a guy that talked about the American founding in very decentralist terms. He understood what it was. He understood the founding to be what it was, which was a federal republic in the United States. And it wasn't some type of creation of a national identity that just didn't exist. Now, nationalism came about later on, but it wasn't there. At least, and some people had it. Don't get me wrong. There were nationalists there. Hamilton was a nationalist. John Marshall was a nationalist. James Madison was a nationalist. George Washington was a nationalist. There were nationalists there. James Wilson. They were all there, but they were in the minority. That has to be emphasized all the time when you talk about the founding period. The nationalists were the minority. In fact, they were in such a minority, their whole design was buried in Philadelphia in 1787. It wasn't supposed to see the light of day. The Constitution that was ratified, that was argued for in the ratification process, was not a national constitution. It was a federal republic. Confederal, federal meant the same thing. In fact, Hamilton himself used the term confederate, to describe the United States. Even under the Constitution, he used that term in the Federalist Essays. He used it, which is interesting. So, American history, unfortunately, has been written by a lot of people who don't like the South, who think the South is this insignificant place, this terrible stain on American society. What they're actually doing is they're not recognizing what American history has been. And this is why I said at the beginning, we've got to be positive about the South. What are the positive contributions? We all know the negative stuff is there. I've said this many, many times in the 6 years or so that I've been doing this podcast for the Institute. 260 episodes, over 60 episodes, right? So the South is America. I've said it many times. And we know all traditions have thorns, but you don't chop down the rose bush because the rose bush has thorns. You enjoy the flowers because they're beautiful and they smell good. And those are the things you want to champion. And that's what we try to do at the Institute all the time. It's what we try to do to ensure that we explore what's true and valuable in the Southern tradition. And we need your help. We need your support to do it. 2022 is going to be another year where we're probably going to see more stuff happen. We got to stay on the offensive and putting out the positive sides of the South. If you want to contribute articles, send them to us. If you go out and get people involved in that Doug Rogers essay contest, that's great too. Go do those things. Make sure you share the podcast around. Share our articles on social media. Do everything you can to try to get people. Help us financially. Do everything you can to try to do that. $5 a month is great. $10 a month is great. $20 a month. It doesn't have to be one big lump sum of money. If you got that too, we'll take it. But if we could have everybody listen to this podcast and on our email list and all those things actually contribute, just $10 a month, boy, we would be doing stuff. We'd have some real money and some real opportunities to make an impact. So I say all that. Until next time, good day.